Hey, Research Stat class, this is Stephanie, and I am coming at you with our first lecture for the new unit, Unit 2. And so in Unit 2, we're going to be talking about chapters 4 and 5 of new information, but we're going to continue using the same information that we've already laid down in chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so, like I said at the beginning of the class, it's really important, right, that you learn the information the first time it's presented to you, because the reality is that you're going to keep seeing this same information over and over and over again. So if you truly learn it the first time, you don't have to relearn it. You're just adding the new information to it, which is a really effective, strong way to study information. So we're going to get started with the chapter 3 and 4 mashup lecture. And again, it's really we're going to be building on the information that we learned in the first unit of the class. So we're going to revisit some ideas and then we're going to add to them. You know, in chapter 3, we focused a lot on things like reliability and validity. And so we're going to see some of those same concepts applied in different ways in this chapter. So the first topic we have to really think about is basic research versus applied research. So basic research is that research that we use it's what we kind of think about when we think about research. So we use it to describe, predict, and explain fundamental psychological phenomena. So in general, when you're reading a research journal, what you are seeing is basic research. We're trying to identify potentially human universals. Applied research is a little bit different. So applied research has a really specific focus. Often we're using it to find solutions to real world problems. And so oftentimes we're doing this more on like the consulting side of psychology, where a company might hire us because they have a specific concern and they're maybe wanting to improve productivity, or they're wanting to understand a little bit more about, what makes their employees happy. They might want to understand ergonomics, things like this. These are all psychological issues, and they have a very focused idea. We're not necessarily trying to find a human universal. We're trying to find a single solution for that particular problem. And so applied research may or may not be published. Oftentimes it's actually not published because it's done for a very specific company and a very specific reason. And so we don't collect the data in a way that would allow us to necessarily generalize that out to other times, people, and places, right? So applied and basic research are very different in that way. Then the focus and the reason that we actually do the research is totally different. So with basic research, like I said, we're going to try to uncover those general properties of behavior, and we do it to understand behavior. A lot of times, basic research is not as appreciated as applied research. A lot of times, this is because it's published in academic journals. So regular people, right, don't even see the basic research, where they might actually be very affected by something applied that's maybe happening at the workplace. Not only that, though, but even in academia, sometimes basic research is not really recognized as important. And so a lot of times we have to champion our ideas to help, for example, the IRB understand the usefulness of the research that we're doing. The IRB is made up, remember, of all kinds of people. It's not just psychologists. And so when we write those IRB methods, we're really having to sell this idea that this research is important. There are benefits not just to ourselves, right, that we get to publish, but there are benefits beyond even just the participants who are participating in the research. So basic research is one of those fascinating things. Without it, we won't know anything about the human condition. But to actually get funding for basic research, sometimes that can be difficult. And we really have to be able to champion our ideas and fight for them when that's necessary. Applied research is not just recognized as being useful. A lot of times we're hired specifically to go in and fix a problem. And so it it results in a lot of useful information that we can use to change behaviors. But again, it's often specific to a single situation. So it might be specific to, for example, one computer program that they're using at one place of business. But because that computer program is unique, what we discover and what we uncover while trying to fix the problems that company is having, those ideas may not translate to other computer programs at other companies. And so because we are often hired to do those specific things, it's easy to get funding, right? They're literally seeking you out saying, hey, I need your help with this problem that I'm having. Obviously, if you're working at a university, even if you're doing applied research, you have to potentially have IRB approval. And the IRB is much more likely to buy into applied research because they can see the immediate benefit. When you put that benefit, it is very clear what it is. It's not just figuring out the human condition, it's solving this specific problem. And in that way, then applied research is very easy to appreciate. Applied research can also be utilized to support the findings from basic research. And this is another huge benefit, actually, of applied research. So when we think about our basic research and all of these kind of things we're trying to figure out about the human condition, we can actually think about how, wow, if we take that information and that we've learned from the 6 studies that we've done, does that actually apply to the real world? And so applied research can actually help us find support, or potentially, right, even fail to support those findings that we have from basic research. There's this really neat field that's kind of the intersection of basic and applied research. It's more on the medical side. It's called translational research or translational science. It's a relatively new field, really. It's been around for about 10 or 15 years. The UT Health Science Center excuse me, the UT Health Science Center and UTSA have a joint degree in translational science now. And they're looking for people with master's degrees, with PhDs, and with MDs to be a part of it. But translational research is really interesting. The idea is that you can have, and I just realized translational is misspelled on the first time in this slide. But the idea is that you can have a person who's educated about medical devices, about the biology, and also maybe a little bit even about marketing and, you know, everything it takes to get a medical device sort of out there. And you can have that person work both with the researchers and the producers of that device and kind of almost act as a go-between. And so people who do translational science really have to have a beautiful understanding of both basic and applied research and be able to describe that and explain that to people from 2 very different points of view, right? The researchers who are just trying to uncover that, you know, the basic research side, and the producers or the marketers who are trying to make money from that idea. So translational research is interesting to me. Again, it's an opportunity for those of you who are planning on going and getting advanced degrees. So related to this idea of basic and applied research is, where do we do our research at? So many times when we're doing research, we think of a laboratory, right? So oftentimes basic research is done in a laboratory. The laboratory gives us greater control of the conditions, right? So remember that experimental control, being able to control all of those extraneous variables is really important for us, especially in psychology. And if we are bringing people into the lab, then we have complete control over where they end up, right? So we can randomly assign them to the different conditions. The other benefit to laboratory research is that it's really easy to abide by the ethics. So when someone comes into your laboratory, it's easy to sit them down, have them read the informed consent form. When they're finished with the study, it's very easy to do a full, appropriate debriefing with them. So often laboratory research is basic research. And the benefit to that is it's really high in experimental realism. So remember, we talked about this at the end of the first unit. We said that experimental realism is that idea that people buy into what they're having to do, that they believe in the experiment, and they are really taking it seriously. The problem with laboratory research is that a lot of times it's very low in mundane realism. And remember that we kind of said mundane realism is the stuff that you do on an everyday basis. And the example I gave you was, I've been teaching a long time, right? But if we look at the Milgram experiment, the teacher was shocking the learner, right? I've been teaching now for 19 years, and not once have I ever had the opportunity to shock a learner, right? And so it's very high experimental realism in the Milgram study. People really bought into this idea that they were really shocking that person, that person had to learn this material to not get shocked. But in terms of mundane realism, like hooking someone up and shocking them, that's just not something that we typically do, even on a yearly basis. It's something that most of us have never ever done before. So very low mundane realism. That might be a problem then, right? If people come into your lab and they're doing something and they really believe in what they're doing and they're doing their best on that thing, but it's not something that they necessarily experience in real life, generalizability might actually become a problem, right? And so you need to start thinking like a scientist here. You need to start thinking about what are the implications of research if it's only high in experimental realism, but it's low in mundane realism, right? And so that may feel really artificial to the participants. It's not something they've ever done before. It's not something they think they'll ever do again. And so that can potentially make it difficult for them to do their best or just act naturally in the situation as well. The benefit to lab research is that a lot of times it's relatively quick and it's relatively inexpensive when we compare it to field research. You've got your lab set up, you've got all of your materials, you can schedule participants one right after the other to come in. And because you're able to abide by ethics, that's another real benefit to the lab research. Field research then is different. Oftentimes when we think about field research, it's applied, but that's definitely not necessarily the case. There are quite a few scientific psychology experiments that are done in the field. A great example of this is the urinal experiment that I had you read for Unit 1 when we were looking at personal space issues, right? And so that's a field research study, but it was not applied research, it was basic research. So field research tends to be applied, but that's not necessarily always the case. Certainly we have basic research that can be done out in the field. The benefit to field research is you're doing it out in the real world. So you're looking at what people naturally do. You're looking at their behaviors in their natural environment. You cannot get more mundane realism than that, right? But partly because of that, if you're going to go in and manipulate something that's obvious to the person, so it's an obvious change in the environment, they may recognize that. And so the research may have very low experimental realism. When you're changing something obvious, there could be pushback on that, or it may be really obvious that you're studying me, right? Which can cause additional problems. Field research, though, is really beneficial. Sometimes we want to study situations that we can't ethically create in a laboratory for a variety of reasons. And so maybe the only way we have to study those issues is to go out in the field. Another great example of that is the cheating study that I have you all read when you are preparing for that first unit of the class as well. So that's obviously a field experiment, right? We went in, we looked at college cheating, and that was done out there in the real world because it's difficult to test cheating in the lab, and sometimes it might even be unethical to do so. Again, field research can be really interesting, as we're studying those, field research can help us confirm the information that we're finding in the lab. And so as we're finding those human universals, again, it's often going to be basic research. We might want to see, does this idea, does this construct work the same when we have all these competing variables out there in the real world. So field research is often time consuming because we're going to have to wait for that situation, whatever it is that we're hoping to capture. We're going to have to wait for it to actually happen. And then once we do that, we're going to have to actually not just wait for it to happen, but we're going to have to wait for it to happen as many times as we need it to happen and be able to really adequately study it. So, you know, if we miss an opportunity, maybe someone's blocking our vision, right? So we're watching from afar and someone steps right in front of you and now you can't see. There's all kinds of things that can get in the way with field research. So it often is time consuming, and because it takes so much time, it can be really expensive. Think about this if you're having to pay for research assistants to help you, things like that. Another issue, and many of you picked up on this when we read the little blurbs for the ethics, and we were talking about the urinal study, but it was a huge potential issue with consenting, right, and debriefing. In the urinal study, one fix that they could have done to make this unquestionably an ethical study, so make it ethical, would be to have the participants, as they're leaving, have someone approach them and say, I know you just went to the restroom. We were actually studying the personal space needs. And so we would like for your consent. And you just explain the research very quickly to them. You know, we were listening to hear how long it took you to start urinating and how long you urinated for, right? That urination duration. And we'd like your permission to use your data. And you could even potentially compensate them, because that felt invasive, right? Even though it's really not invasive, you're using your ears and you can hear people in the public restroom. It felt invasive. And so you might want to offer them some kind of compensation for that, a $5 Starbucks gift card or something like that. But that would allow you then to have this field research that does feel invasive when you're reading about it. It would allow you to have permission, right, consent to use the data. You wouldn't want someone out there ahead of time saying, hey, I know you got to use the restroom, but can I talk to you for a second? Because maybe they can't wait a second for you. But above and beyond that, let's say that, they're leisurely strolling to the restroom. They've got time. If you are telling them ahead of time, hey, you're going to go in, there might be someone at the urinal, there might not, or there might be someone right next to you where they might have skipped one. And what we're trying to see is how long it takes you to start urinating and how long you're going to urinate for. You say those kinds of, you just ruin the experiment, right? So with field research, we often do consenting and debriefing after the data has been collected. And again, it may be the case that we can't even get an appropriate consent or debriefing. But because you're watching people in their natural environment, that's a completely appropriate thing to do. So one of the things that we would like to see is something called field lab research correspondence. And this is the extent to which we get similar findings when we conduct research in the field and when we're conducting research in the lab. So, lab and field research, I think when we talk about them and when you read about them in the book, they kind of feel like they're mutually exclusive, right? So you are either doing one or you're doing the other. But again, they both are important, and you can use, field research to sort of verify your findings in the lab. In that way, then this field lab correspondence is actually quite important for us. We should not be just conducting our experiments in the lab and not seeing if those same constructs work in the same way outside of the lab. It's actually an important component to psychological research. So we need to use both types of studies in our research. All right. So we talked a lot last unit about validity and reliability. And remember that when I say reliability, you should think consistency. And when I say validity, you should think accuracy, right? So if that's the case, right, reliability is the idea of consistency. We have a new type of reliability that we can start to think about in this unit, and it is called study reliability. This is how consistent the results are across similar studies. Remember that one of the things that we said when we discussed science in the first chapter, we said that one of the things we hope is that people will take our ideas and then try to replicate them in their lab, right? We don't own our ideas in psychology. We need other people to be testing those ideas. And so when we think about study reliability, this becomes a really important issue. So how consistent are the results across similar studies? So there are two ways that we can think about these, what we call replication studies. The first is to have a literal replication. It is the exact same study. Everything is defined the same. Everything is controlled the same. And the only difference is that you're doing the same study with new participants. Literal replications are great if the initial study really supported your theory and worked beautifully. But as we know in psychology, right, we have that interplay of theory and research, because a lot of times our research informs the theory. It means that we have to change the theory a little bit, tweak the theory a little bit. And so it may be the case that as that theory is evolving a little bit, our studies change ever so slightly. And so we might have to do what's called a conceptual replication. So here we're going to examine the same pattern or relationship. You can think about it like we're testing the same constructs, but we're potentially going to use different methods. We might go ahead and define the construct slightly differently. We might actually change the methods. Maybe we did a survey the first time. Maybe we're going to do a face-to-face interview the second time. So in a conceptual replication, you're still looking at those same ideas, but in a different way. And both of these have their place in psychology. Most of the studies that you're going to read in journal articles are conceptual replications. So we have a theory, we have an idea, and then we have to test it over and over and over. And so you see a lot of these kind of conceptual replication studies. In terms of validity at the study level, we've already talked a little bit about this, right? So internal validity, remember, is the degree to which we can say that we're confident that we found an accurate relationship among the variables. So when we did the manipulation in the independent variable, it caused that change we saw in the dependent variable. So internal validity, remember, is going to be established by kind of how clean your experiment is. External validity is the degree to which we can say that the results of a study are accurate for different people in different settings assessed with different procedures. In other words, remember that external validity is going to be more related to the generalizability of our findings. So, oftentimes we kind of think about the internal and external validity as kind of being like on those scales of justice, right? So if one is high, the other is low, and if one is low, the other is high. But it doesn't necessarily always have to be that way. A lot of times it is that way. So the higher the internal validity, the harder it is to achieve external validity, and vice versa. But it's not, this beautiful scales of justice kind of thing. Certainly you can be high in both internal and external validity, and a really poorly done study is definitely going to be low in both. And so, what you're looking for as a researcher is kind of a balance. You'd like to have moderate to high internal and external validity whenever that's possible. And if you have a good clean study and you've really got a good variety in your sample, it's totally possible to balance your internal and external validity. So we're going to start thinking about descriptive studies. Now, we've been talking about descriptive statistics, right? Remember that descriptive statistics are going to kind of describe the sample. They're going to take all of that information we know about the sample in terms of numbers, right? And they're going to kind of condense it down into a single statistic. So descriptive studies, you might guess, use descriptive statistics. And descriptive studies seek to answer who, what, where, when, and how questions, right? Kind of like the sleuth questions that you learned when you were younger. So thinking about then those different types of studies, we have to sort of decide, when is a descriptive study our best bet? So if we're trying to understand things like prevalence and trends, we definitely want to use a descriptive study. So descriptive studies are used quite a bit in political science. They're used also in historical research as well. We can also use them when we're trying to explore a particular phenomenon very deeply. And so a descriptive study gives us a lot of information about that particular construct. And we can also use descriptive studies when we're looking at a phenomenon that we know exists, but maybe we're changing the population that we're investigating it in. A descriptive study can give us a lot of information relatively quickly about what that phenomenon looks like in that different population. When we think about descriptive studies, we have a couple of types of validity that we want to think about. So we already talked about internal and external validity in terms of the study validity, but we also need to think about measurement validity. And these are the validities that we talked about in the first unit. So things like convergent validity, discriminant validity, and even construct validity becomes an issue here, right? To what extent is the measure that we're using in this study actually measuring what it was intended to measure? That's, almost exactly what we thought of when we thought about construct validity. And then you'll remember that all of those other validities contributed to that big idea of construct validity. So if we're trying to create this descriptive study, there are different ways that we can collect all that data. You are going to be creating a survey later this semester. And when we get to the first lecture for the third unit, actually right after the exam, I'm sorry. So you'll have exam 2, and then that next day after the exam, another video is going to release for you talking a lot about your survey project and some survey methods. But in this chapter, we talk really quickly about measurement methods and some survey issues. In survey research, we're asking people to report on their personal attitudes and on their behaviors. It could be behaviors that they are performing already, so things they're already doing, or it could be asking them in the future, what do you think you would do in this particular situation? So there's a lot of ways to think about survey research. The best part about survey research is that we can get information that we can't necessarily directly observe. So we can ask people about their thoughts and their feelings. Those are things that I can't necessarily observe. But there are a number of cons with survey research. One is the social desirability bias. Participants tend to respond based on how they want to be perceived, as opposed to how they actually behave sometimes. A great example of this is spanking research. So when we do research spanking, what we find is that, most research is showing that in America, only about 40% of parents agree that it's okay to spank your kids. But if we actually, and that's just regular survey research. So if we do research where there is a perceived anonymity or confidentiality, that number goes up to almost 80%. It almost doubles in terms of the number of parents who tell us, we're not asking, do you spank your kids? We ask, do you think it's okay to spank your kids? And again, that number almost doubles. And it also matters who's doing the research. There's some evidence that if the school is doing the research, so a school district is doing that research, that number is very low. So very few parents say, yes, I think it's okay to spank your kids. But if the parent feels like it's really an independent source doing the survey, they are much more likely to say that they do think that spanking their kids is okay. That is all due to social desirability, right? We're all supposed to think that it's not necessarily a good thing to spank your kids, right? So admitting that you think it's okay might be very difficult if you think that you can either be identified later, especially by your child's school district, right? Or if you just think that, okay, I'm going to be somehow tracked down for being a spanker. And so I'm not judging anyone one way or the other. I'm just giving you the facts about what social desirability does to our surveys when we are asking those kinds of questions. Another way that we can collect data is by an interview. So there are lots of different ways that we can do interviews. We can do in-person, over the phone, and email interviews. So there are a lot of pros to an interview. Participants, especially if it's a one-on-one format, often take an interview very seriously. So they're very likely to respond to every question, and they're very likely to actually be thoughtful when they're doing that. So the accuracy tends to be relatively good. Above and beyond that, the interviewer, if you're doing a face-to-face interview, the interviewer can see things like crossed arms, shaking legs, nonverbal cues that might actually help us know if someone's telling the truth or if they maybe have more to say. And so the other thing that is a real benefit to interviews is that you can ask for clarifying questions, or you can ask follow-up questions. So if you don't feel like you got all the information that you needed, you may be able to ask additional questions. One of the cons for interviews, though, is that anonymity is difficult. Obviously, if I'm sitting in front of you and we're having a face-to-face conversation, you are no longer anonymous. And this can be a real problem then when we talk about social desirability bias. In face-to-face interviews, that number for, is it okay to spank your kids is really close to the 40%. Interviewer bias is also really interesting. So even well-trained psychometricians may accidentally at different times give off both verbal and nonverbal responses that could actually change the participant's answer to questions. And so even just a small smile or a tiny frown, or kind of closing your arms, not even realizing that you're necessarily doing that, all of these things can be cues to your participant that you're not answering the way that they might that you're expecting. And because of that, even if you're not realizing you're doing that, and even if you're just uncomfortable, whatever the case may be, but because of those small things, it may actually greatly influence your participants. And so it is something to be mindful of, and it is something to be potentially concerned about. When we talk about interviews, especially those face-to-face interviews, we can think about structured interviews versus not structured interviews. We also have something called a semi-structured interview. So in a structured interview, you have a standard set of questions. They are asked in the same way of every person every time. So there is no deviation from those standard questions. Structured interviews are relatively common because they are so standardized. So we know we're going to get a similar experience for every person who's participating. In this semi-structured interview, a researcher or an interviewer has the base set of questions. Every answer that interviewer is going to get is going to lead to either another question, or it's going to lead to a follow-up or a clarification, or it's going to lead to an end to the interview. So you can almost think about a semi-structured interview is kind of following almost like a flow chart, which is kind of a neat thing. Those of you who have taken cognition or learning, or even you might just remember this from your Gen Psych class, right? But Piaget used the semi-structured interview method when he was studying cognitive development in children. Remember, he was doing this in France, and so it was called the méthode clinique. That's a fancy way of saying the clinical method, right? And it was based on clinicians at the time, back in the 1920s, had these very kind of semi-structured interviews. and the result, the answer that you gave to the clinician would lead to the next question. So semi-structured interviews can be really useful because you can clarify questions potentially, depending on, Piaget did not allow that. Piaget just kind of had a flow chart. He didn't really allow his researchers to go off of the flow chart. Today we have researchers who are a little more lax. And so if they can think of a follow-up question, they do obviously have to make a note of what that question was, because now they're going a little bit off the script, off the flow chart, but they are allowed to do more of that kind of follow-up. Semi-structured interviews are much more difficult actually to do than structured interviews. Structured interviews is a script, you can't deviate from it, you're always just following the script, whereas semi-structured interviews, you really have to process what the participant is saying very quickly. You have to be able to come up with those unique additional questions, clarifying questions. And so a semi-structured interview takes a lot of training, and there are a lot of people who aren't necessarily very good at doing the semi-structured interview. All right, another type of measure is a questionnaire, and your homework for this last week was to think about questionnaires that you'd seen, right? We had just finished the exam, and I know you hadn't had a whole lot of time to get into the chapter 4 yet. So I wanted you to just think about, like, what kind of questionnaires have you seen, like, out there in the real world? We are bombarded with questionnaires in our world today. Almost every time you buy something online, right, that little pop-up comes up, hey, do you mind answering a few questions? That's a questionnaire. If you call your bank, or your insurance company, do you mind answering a few questions at the end of this call? We have a ton of data collection happening all around us, and that is in the form of questionnaires. Questionnaires can be scored in a number of different ways. They can test one construct or multiple constructs. It's just however they are designed. And that's that questionnaire is going to be scored in different ways. So if it has a single construct, you're adding stuff, maybe you're reverse scoring things. We'll talk about all of that as we get into the ideas of survey format. But a scale score takes the items that are pertinent to that particular construct and then sums them or averages them. So you get a kind of single number that represents that construct. If you have multiple constructs on the questionnaire, you'll have multiple construct numbers, right? For the response format on questionnaires, oftentimes we use a forced choice response format. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what did you think about this? Or we may have very specific, phrases that you're answering or that you can choose from for your answers. One of the reasons we do that is that when you leave a response open-ended on a questionnaire, you are really kind of leaving yourself, at a disadvantage potentially. If someone's just trying to get finished with your questionnaire, they may not answer questions or may not answer them thoroughly as they could. And so those open-ended questions can be kind of dangerous. So we kind of prefer those close-ended responses where people have to make forced, choices or have very limited response formats. For questionnaires, especially in terms of these, paper questionnaires or even online, there can be potentially a lot of pros. They can allow for anonymity. You could send off a bunch of questionnaires to neighborhoods in San Antonio, and then people just send back the prepaid envelope, and you would never know who's sending back what, right? Online, it's potentially also an issue that you can have that anonymity. So you can have multiple participants completing at the same time. I mean, you can mail out 1,000 questionnaires and potentially have 1,000 people doing that. We'll talk about why that almost never happens in a few minutes, but you could potentially do that. And administration of questionnaires is super easy. You're just going to create the questionnaire and then get people to do it. If you're doing it in an academic setting, obviously you would still need to go through the IRB, but usually because questionnaires tend to be relatively innocuous, we often have what we call expedited review through the IRB for questionnaires. So if they're not asking sensitive questions, if they're not asking personal questions, it's very quick to get a questionnaire study through the IRB. There are a number of issues with questionnaires, though. First of all, if you mail out a questionnaire, so actual mail, the average response rate is only between 5 to 10%. So the response rates are the return rates are incredibly low. If you are doing an online questionnaire, this also potentially has a low response rate, although one of the kind of newer ways to get people to respond to that is to put them in a drawing of some sort, right? Encourage them to participate in some way in the survey, and that's perfectly fine. Also, as we'll learn when we talk about snowball sampling, especially for those online studies, I filled it out. I got entered for the $500 gift card, right? And now you're going to maybe ask your friend to fill out the survey. Well, it came from someone the friend knows and trusts, so they may be more likely to do it. So online surveys actually have relatively good response rates if it's something meaningful to the participant, or if we're using something like snowball sampling, where I know the person who's sending me this survey, I trust that person, and I'm more likely to do it. And then I'm going to send that survey to other people who also trust me. And that's how we're going to get a lot of people to complete the survey. One of the problems with surveys, whether they're mailed or online, is that participants may not believe that their responses are anonymous. They may believe that they can be tracked in some way. That's especially true with online surveys. People think that you have their IP address and maybe can go find them. So that's a real issue. And one final thing for these online questionnaires that's a con is that you cannot really guarantee that the person who's taking the survey is the person who they say they are. And I have a very real world example of this. When my son was very young, we used to have this little Muppet Babies CD that he used to use to learn to read, and he was like 6 years old. And so on Saturday mornings, he was allowed to go to my computer. We would leave it on Friday night, so that on Saturday morning he could go in and start his little Muppet Babies reading CD. And that was all he was supposed to touch, and we would set it up for him. And one Friday I messed up and I didn't set up his little stuff for him. And I woke up not too long after Tristan woke up, but I went to the computer room and I could see that he was in my email. I could see this is not Muppet Babies, right? And he's in my email. And I kind of peek over because I saw him clicking on stuff. And I was, what is this kid doing, right? So I stopped what I was doing in the kitchen, and I kind of just go up behind him quietly and I peek. And the first word I see is gonorrhea. And I'm like, why is a 6-year-old, like, first of all, why is that in my email? And second of all, why is a 6-year-old looking at this? And so it ended up being a friend of mine who was attending UT Austin had sent out a survey for one of her research classes, and it was on what people knew and understood about STDs. And so I'm like, Tristan, why are you doing this? Like, that was addressed to mommy. And he said he thought he was helping me. But because he saw that and he thought he was helping, but he was a 6-year-old who clicked that he was over 18 because he was answering the questions for mommy, and mommy was over 18, he thought. And so it was a real lesson for me, when the internet was just kind of first starting, about how many problems there might be with online questionnaires, people taking it more than once, especially nowadays. We have so many devices. You could take it on your phone, you could take it on your iPad, you can take it on your computer. So even if I'm worried about, the same person taking it multiple times, so I'm going to pay attention to IP addresses, I can still have the same person taking it multiple times because they're actually using other devices. It's a real issue for us. So there are a lot of issues right now with questionnaires, and and these devices. So when we talk about in-person questionnaires, again, high response rate, the researcher can get clarification if needed, and they're can be relatively inexpensive. It depends on how long the questionnaire takes. But again, you could potentially have a room of people, right? This is different than an interview. A questionnaire is still going to be, usually pen and paper or on the computer. So you could potentially have a room full of people. Even a long questionnaire then is going to be relatively cheap to administer. The cons, it's work intensive. The longer that questionnaire is, the longer people are writing stuff and having to check boxes and think, the quicker they want to get through with it. And so especially towards the end of a very long questionnaire, they may just be tired, and you may see some of those fatigue effects. The other issue is that, in an in-person questionnaire, participants may not believe they're anonymous. And so that could potentially cause issues. For the mailed questionnaires, like we said, they're convenient, but you have a really low response rate, and they can be really expensive. If I'm going to have to send out 1,000 questionnaires to get hopefully 100 responses, I've had to make all those copies. I've had to buy all those envelopes. I've had to stuff them. I've had to get them in the mail. I've had to pay for all that postage. And then I still have to pay for the postage back. It gets expensive really quickly. And so that's one reason why we don't do as many mailed questionnaires anymore. For those online questionnaires, again, they can be really convenient, especially with snowball sampling. Gosh, you can get so many people so fast. The one really cool thing is you can reach people from around the world. So I have friends overseas. I have friends in Australia. I have friends in Great Britain, and I have a friend in Italy. And so I've got people kind of all over the world. When I share stuff on Facebook, if they see it and want to participate, they can. And so it's a really neat way to get a very varied sample. Usually the response rate is pretty good, and it's cheap. You create it one time, you send out a couple emails, and all of a sudden you've got people responding, right? But the biggest con is that the utility of this method varies depending on the topic studied. If you're asking about, do you remember when the internet first started, and you're posting, a link to that on like your Instagram, well, you're going to get young people who don't remember when the internet first started. You need older people like me, right? And so you really have to consider, is the online questionnaire the right questionnaire for the sample that I'm hoping to capture? And if the answer to that is no, then you need to find a better way to actually collect that data. All right. We are going to kind of end this lecture today thinking about the different kinds of measures. We have observational measures that we use, and those observational measures are going to be all kinds of things that we do in psychology, where we're going to watch an event happening, and we are going to train observers to rate the behaviors that they're seeing. Sometimes the participants know that we're watching them. Sometimes they don't, right? So in the lab, if we're doing an observational measure, obviously they would know. If we're doing that in the field, they may not know. Unobtrusive measures are measures that are made of behaviors or situations where we do not impact in any way the naturally occurring behavior or situation. So this is kind of interesting. If you think back to the urinal study from Unit 1, it is an observational measure, right? We're paying attention to a particular person in a situation. And it is actually an obtrusive measure because we had that Confederate be at a specific urinal, right? And so we did not allow the natural occurring thing to happen. Now we could have, but it would have taken a long time, right, to capture enough data. And so they manipulated the situation. It was an obtrusive measure then, not an unobtrusive measure. All right, in observational research, we're going to pay attention to what organisms do, whether they're humans or whether they're animals. Observational research is fantastic because we're watching behaviors. And remember, with that behaviorist revolution, right, this push to be a science in the early 1920s, that's exactly what we were told we should be doing. People, typically speaking, are horrible at predicting what they would do in situations. So if I ask you right now, hey, the house next door is on fire, there's a dog inside, what would you do? Everyone thinks they're going to be a hero. But when we actually have a fire situation and people know there's a dog inside, people aren't going to risk their lives usually to go save that dog. Even the owners typically aren't going to do that. And so we often are not good at predicting the behaviors that we will have in specific situations. And so when we focus on what people do, as opposed to what they say they would do, we actually are getting great data. The problem, obviously, with observational research is that it can be very time consuming, and it could potentially be prone to observer bias. Sometimes the observers are well trained and they still miss things that, maybe if they're counting, let's say they're trying to count how many times someone, a kid on the playground hits another kid on the playground. One person counted 7 times, one person counted 6 times. So observers can miss things, they can misconstrue things, not on purpose, of course, but we're all humans and we're looking at the world through our human eyes, and our human eyes definitely have biases at times. There are a number of ways to combat observer bias. We can have blind observers, and this means that they do not know the conditions. So we have single blind studies where the participant doesn't know what condition they're in. We have double blind studies where the observer doesn't know which condition the participants are in, and the participants don't know. And we even have something called a triple blind study nowadays. In a triple blind study, the statistician doesn't know what the conditions are. The researcher or observer doesn't know what condition the participants were in, and the participants don't know which condition they were in. And so a single blind, double blind, and triple blind study, all very important. Those blind observers, they make a big difference. We don't want them to know the hypothesis necessarily, because if they know the hypothesis, they might actually be unknowingly and not necessarily trying to do it, but they might actually be employing bias then if they knew the conditions and they knew the hypotheses. To combat observer bias, obviously we want to train our observers. Many years ago, I had a really neat opportunity to work on a project with Harvard University and UTSA. We were looking at dreams and did people have intrusions in their dreams under different conditions. And we were not told what the hypothesis was at all. So we were blind, and our training was almost 2 months long. And that was 2 months, 40 hours a week, learning about how to code the data, learning about what the researchers expected from us, and then actually practicing. So out of, I think it was almost 500 participants, they took, I want to say it was 50, I believe it was 10%, a little more than 50 of those participants. And we use those as practice data. And so that, gosh, that training was intense. And finally, once we were all giving very similar answers, so we knew that we had been trained in similar ways and had this similar expectations, then we were allowed to work on the data. You can test inter-rater reliability. This is the most common way to do that, right? So once we were all grading or scoring these packets in similar ways, they were testing our inter-rater reliability. Once it was above a 0.8, that's when we were allowed to start actually conducting the research and scoring the packets. You can also have really structured observations. So you're looking for very specific things. You might have checklists or tick lists that you're keeping. And all of those things can help make observational research really successful. There are all kinds of ways to collect data. You might be collecting a narrative, so listening to someone speak. You might have those checklists. You might actually be timing people, if how long something takes, or you could look at task completion time. You could be looking at reaction time. You could be looking at the latency, so the time it takes to start something. And you could have rating scales. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think that you observed? So all of these are ways to test or to collect the observational data. When we're doing observational research, sometimes we're doing it covertly and sometimes overtly. So in covert observation, we don't tell the participants that they're being observed. In overt observations, the researchers reveal that they are observing. When we do that naturalistic observation is happening in the natural environment. There's no intrusion, there's no interference. In a contrived observation, we have something that maybe looks like it's in the field. It looks like it's natural, but the situation has been set up for the purpose to study reactions. It can happen in the lab, but it's also very common to have this out in the real world. That said, contrived research is done a little bit less today than it used to be. It was very popular in the 70s and the 80s. And one example of why we don't do it anymore is we used to have these mock emergencies. We wanted to know, how do people respond in emergency situations? What do they do? How do they deal with these different ideas? And so researchers would go out, and in this contrived situation, they might have someone faint or act drunk, and then pass out. But there was a real incident at one of the University of California campuses where somebody was actually in need of medical help and nobody helped them. And as they were questioning people, like, why didn't you help? The number one answer they were getting is that they thought it was just a psych experiment. What a wake-up call, right? And so when we're doing these experiments in the natural environment, we really need to be careful and very aware of the impact that we're having, not just necessarily on the participants, but even on, future willingness to act in different situations, things like that. That's really something that we need to be thinking about. Another thing that we can consider is the researcher involved in the situation or not? So sometimes the researcher actually becomes a participant in the situation. This was, again, very common in the late 60s, early 70s. And we would have these psychologists go and join these cults and become members so that they could collect data as an insider, right? So they were participant observers. Obviously, participant observers did not reveal that they were researchers. And so there are some ethical concerns involved there, because they weren't buying into the ideas necessarily. They were just trying to collect the data. That said, back in the 70s, it was considered an ethical thing to do. Today, we would have a little more difficulty getting that through the IRB. In a non-participant observation, the researcher is not directly involved in the situation. So I always think about that as maybe like the two-way mirrors, right? Where, you might be being watched, but you don't know if you are for sure. And you don't know who's watching you, right? And so when we make these observations, there's an important distinction between if the researcher is involved or not. The last kind of measures that I really wanted to talk about are the physiological measures. So we talked about surveys and questionnaires and all these other things, but more and more in psychology, we are using physiological measures. This is measures of different body functions. So we have things like the galvanic skin response, which is measuring sort of, the amount of sweat that your palms are producing. It also can measure temperature. It can also, the galvanic skin response machines can measure a lot of things. We might be measuring heart rate. We might be measuring blood pressure. We might be measuring salivary cortisol. There's all kinds of things that we can measure, right? We might be taking EKGs or EEGs. There's all kinds of physiological measures today that we use in all different kinds of research. So stress research uses a lot of the blood pressure, cortisol, kind of physiological measures. Cognition might actually be looking at functional MRIs. We might be looking at brain waves and things like that. So physiological measures are becoming much, much more common thanks to technology. And then finally, archival research. So we don't do a lot of archival research in psychology. It's covered in the book. Again, remember, this is a social sciences book, not so much a psychology book, but psychologists on occasion will do archival research. So in archival research, you're looking at the analysis of existing data or records. So this could be hospital records. Think about this from a psychological point of view. You might want to look at old clinician records at a mental health hospital to determine, has depression changed over time? What was schizophrenia right before it was called schizophrenia? Can we identify some of that in the old records? And so certainly there's a place for archival research in psychology. We just don't do it all that often. All right, you guys, that's it for this unit, or for this chapter, sorry. And again, it's really important, if you haven't already studied chapter 3, if you didn't do well on the exam for chapter 3, go back, relearn that stuff, restudy it really well, because it really is important when we're getting to chapter 4. Those two chapters go together. Okay. If you have any questions, please shoot me off an email, and you guys have a great rest of your day. Bye.